سلام الله عليكم ورحمته وبركاته متتبعي ومحبي جافا بالعربي أو جافا مستخدمي جافا في العالم العربي. مرحبا بكم في حدث جديد ولقاء جديد مع صديقي العزيز. سيخبرني اليوم عن ما هي مستجدات جاكرتا اي اي. آه، ولا أريد أن أطيل عليكم. رحبوا معي برزا. رزا، السلام عليكم.
وعليكم السلام يا حبيبي.
كيف حالك يا عزيزي؟
الحمد لله. أنا بخير. وأنت؟
الحمد لله. سعيد جدا بتواجدك معنا وشكرا كثيرا على قبولك دعوتنا.
لا مشكلة. To me, this is really a great honor. I'll share a 5-minute story about this. If you don't mind. So as you saw, I tried to speak Arabic for a little bit. This is the first time in 35 years, that I've spoken Arabic actually. So in my childhood, I spent a little bit of my childhood in Egypt, in Alexandria, and in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh. So for me, you guys are my brothers. You'll always be my brothers. I hope so you see it that way also. And honestly,
Absolutely. Yeah.
this is a special talk for me, because obviously it's a special talk for me. I've been in the Jakarta EE ecosystem for a long time, probably more time than I would have liked to admit. So this is the first time I'm delivering this Jakarta EE 10 talk. So it's a proud moment for me that I'm delivering this talk, this important talk to me, the very first time, to people that are important to me also.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And we consider you as a brother, and you are more than a brother to me. We met you more than 5, 6 years back, Morocco, and super pumped to meet each other and discuss everything related to Java and Java EE and everything in between. Thanks again for accepting our invite, and more than happy and excited to welcome you to Arab Java user group. It's been a long journey, but yeah, we're here. So if you can share your slides, and
Yeah.
then we'll let you handle it from there. If you can
All right.
switch to the slides, and I
Yeah, I'll
can
do
put
that.
them in
And,
the.
let me do the share screen.
It's shared. Just
It's
switch
already
to.
sharing. Okay, that's
Yeah.
even better. So let me just start my slides, and we should be good to go. I just need to swap.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you can see it okay?
Yes, it's okay. The stage is yours. I'm going to be in the backstage, and if there is any questions, I will just jump in and ask it to you. So yeah, stage is yours.
Yeah, so I'm going to stop for a little bit. So there's no reason anyone needs to hold questions until the very end. That's generally not how I do talks anyway. So yeah, I'll pause a little bit here and there, so you can ask me questions at that point in time. And also, if I'm just going on and not stopping, just stop me and ask the question, and it's all good. Okay. So, I think I already said a little bit about what this talk is. This talk is about Jakarta E10. This is the newest release of Jakarta. I think a long-awaited one. I'll talk about that in a moment. And I think an important one for our industry also. Whether you're not a Jakarta EE user right now, or whether you think you're not a Jakarta EE user, this is a very important release. So I think everybody should be aware of it, and everybody understand, what exactly is going on with this release. Maybe more importantly, I'll also be spending a little bit of time talking about what is next, and also, how you guys can contribute, how all of us can contribute to making all of these things happen. And honestly, it would be really good to see more participation and see more Muslim and Arabic speaking faces in this effort. I think I might be the only one in this whole endeavor these days that has anything to do with any kind of background similar to us. So, seeing more people from our background, I think, is a very important thing also, just from a representation perspective. So, in my day job, just to give a little bit of introduction of myself, in my day job, I'm principal program manager for Java on Azure. I'm not really doing this talk as my day job though. I will be soon. I'll, just keep an eye on my Twitter, and you'll see what I mean by that. So I won't say anything more about that yet. But today I'm here in an unofficial capacity. I'm here as a Jakarta EE Ambassador. I'll talk to you a little bit about what the Jakarta EE Ambassadors are. And also, on my screen is my email address as well as my Twitter handle. I'm easy to reach, right? So if you have any questions, concerns, just want to say salam, it's all good stuff, right? You can reach out to me. Okay. So hopefully by this point, everybody knows what Jakarta EE is. Just in case you don't, I'll have this very brief slide to talk about it a little bit. So Jakarta EE is the technology formerly known as Java EE. It used to be in the JCP or Java Community Process, so basically part of Oracle. A few years ago, thanks to some things that happened in the community, I think all good stuff, it basically has moved to the Eclipse Foundation. And as a result, it needed to be renamed to Jakarta EE instead of Java EE, so very similar sounding name. And the big change actually is a very positive one. And in fact, speaking, a lot of us have wished this kind of change for a long time before it happened. And in fact, I still wish the same kind of change may happen even to Java SE at some point. So basically, the JCP, while it's open, and I would certainly call it an open standard, is still basically a more or less Oracle-owned process, right? So the JCP itself is not an independent entity. It's owned by Oracle. And Oracle has certain special privileges inside of the JCP. Whereas the big difference in the Eclipse Foundation is that none of that actually exists. So everything, including all of the IP, all of the code, really just belongs to no specific company, but an independent nonprofit organization, namely the Eclipse Foundation. And it's also, nobody has any special privileges. Like everybody is exactly the same. So it still has the same things that would define an open standard, the same way that there is in the JCP. There's open governance. It's all open source, including the TCK. By the way, in the JCP, that didn't used to be the case. The TCK was always closed source. So now the TCK is also open source, and you can basically self-certify. That's a big improvement over the JCP also. But other than that, not really much. Those are big changes, right? But some things has remained the same, right? So still the same technology set, as you'll see in a moment, is still evolving, but more or less the same APIs, and basically the same set of stakeholders, right? Plus or minus. But Oracle, IBM, Red Hat, Payara, VMware, all of the major stakeholders that either depend on this technology or have an implementation of it, they're still very heavily involved in this. And in fact, what I can objectively say is that it used to be that under the JCP, it was actually quite heavily Oracle driven. So if you really look at the investment, it was more than 50-60%, maybe even more, driven by Oracle. Whereas if you look at the contributions now, it's actually more even, right? So it's more evenly broken down by all of the key stakeholders. Now, one of the reasons some of us were hoping to accomplish by moving to the Eclipse Foundation is actually making it much easier for end user developers, so people like you and me, to participate in this. Okay, so I have to be honest, while technically speaking, this is now much easier, this is where maybe we have not succeeded as of yet, right? So I think there's between, unless I'm completely wrong with the numbers, maybe about 50 some people that develop in the specifications on and off. So this number really should be much higher, right? It should be something like, in my opinion, hundreds or thousands. Okay, maybe hundreds of thousands of Arabs, that can join in this process and really actually move it forward. So if you want to find out more about this, URL is really simple. Open up your browser and just type in jakarta.ee, and that's the place to find out pretty much anything you want about the Jakarta EE process and technologies and so on. All right. So I know some of you are thinking, oh, this is old stuff, right? Who cares? Jakarta EE, is it even important anymore? It doesn't surprise me if you're thinking that. You should rethink that a bit if that's what you think, right? Because the reality is that Jakarta EE has always been an important part of the overall health of the ecosystem, and it continues to be. All right. So just to put some numbers around this, depending on what kind of survey you look at, 25 to 35% of Java applications still run on a Jakarta EE application server. Right? So things like Wildfly, JBoss AP, Pyara, WebSphere, OpenLiberty, WebSphere Liberty, WebLogic, what have you. Right. So that's, however you look at it, 1 in 4 Java developers or 1 in 3 Java developers, right? So when you say this technology set doesn't matter, you're really saying, the work that these people are doing, all these developers are doing on this technology doesn't matter, right? So obviously that's not right, right? And let's say you don't use those app servers and you're using something else. If you look just a little bit deeper, what you'll find is all of that something else is actually using Java EE technologies or Jakarta EE technologies in some way or the other. All right. So whether you're using Tomcat or Hibernate or ActiveMQ or Jetty or CFX, Jersey, REST-API, Quarkus, Microprofile, Spring, more and more and more, right? All you need to do is look one level deeper, and you'll find, oh, there's Jakarta EE, there's a Jakarta EE API, right? So it's incredibly important, really, when you take an objective look at it and you really ask developers an honest, informed question of are you dependent on Jakarta EE? If you pose that question in that way, my suspicion is 90% of intelligent Java developers will say, yeah, that's the case. I'm dependent on this technology, right? So it's a very, very important technology, and in order to keep things healthy and moving forward, you need all of the pieces, all of the things that we depend on to keep moving forward also, right? So we definitely need to make sure that this technology set remains vibrant so that we as Java developers continue to be vibrant, right? To continue to have jobs, continue to have opportunities. So yeah, Jakarta EE is not a new technology, that's for sure, right? It's a little bit less old than Java itself, but it's pretty old, right? First it was called JTE. Probably most people don't remember what that is. It's Java Professional Edition. And then there was J2EE set of technologies, right? And some people are still stuck on J2EE. J2EE has been, I think, dead in almost close to 15 years now. All right. And then there was Java EE for a period of time. So Java EE5, Java EE6, Java EE7, Java EE8. And those are all still developed under the JCP. The move to the Eclipse Foundation happened with Jakarta EE8, and basically it was a one-to-one move. It's basically taking all of the code that was running in the JCP, all of the process that was happening in the JCP, and moving it to another place and doing a release. Okay, so that was Jakarta EE8. So literally binary compatible, exactly the same as Java EE8. And that took some time, right? And that caused some frustration with some people. Although I don't think there's reason to be very frustrated, in my opinion. Because in the time that this transition was happening, people that were actually dependent on Java EE technologies, I know what they were doing. Right? They were basically depending on microprofile, because the microprofile technology set was churning out releases literally every 6 months, while this transition from Java EE8 to Jakarta EE8 was happening. Right? So no real net loss. Right? So you're still keeping up to date with new technologies, even if you're doing microservices-based development, you still have a good option, right? By combining Java EE or Jakarta EE with microprofile. Now, all that aside, then last year or so we had Jakarta EE9. I'll talk about that in a moment. And now, literally within a month at max, you will have Jakarta EE10. Okay, so Jakarta EE9 was all about the namespace transition. I'll explain what the namespace transition is in just a moment. But Jakarta EE10 is really about beginning to deliver new features. Okay, so this is a lively ecosystem, however you look at it, right? So then don't let people tell you otherwise. If you look, this is a trends report from InfoQ. Okay, so as you can see, all of these Java EE technologies are there somewhere, right? So it's a lively changing thing, and you also have things like microprofile in the mix. You also have things like Quarkus in the mix, and so on. So a very healthy ecosystem, actually, if you really take a look at it from an objective standpoint. Okay, so what was Jakarta EE 9 and 9.1? Well, as I've told you before, we moved from the JCP to the Eclipse Foundation, so the name had to change, right, from Java EE to Jakarta EE. Well, you also had to make a change to the package name, right? So you have a full decoupling, not only from the naming, but also from the branding and copywriting. So 9 and 9.1 really was about that. So it was about renaming the package name from Javax to Javax to Jakarta. And obviously, this is a breaking change, right? So you will have to either run through some migration tooling or do sort of a find and replace, manual find and replace, but pretty easy one, based on what I've talked to a few people that have done this. It's really not that hard to do. It's just doing some simple changes to move from one namespace to the other. Now with 9 and 9.1, there was a few other changes also. So there were some older technologies that were already deprecated. Those were removed. And we also upgraded the Java version, right? So Java E8 was Java SE8, whereas 9.1 is Java SE11 minimum. But most Jakarta E9 runtimes actually support something like Java 17, right? But officially, at least a move from Java SE8 to Java SE11. If you haven't begun doing this migration yet, you will need to do it. Okay, so whether you're using Spring or Hibernate or Jakarta EE app servers like JBoss EAP, Wildfly, you will need to begin doing this. So if you haven't done that, the biggest thing maybe you should take away from this session today is you need to begin considering how you're going to do this migration, and there's different strategies of how to do that. There's some really nice blog entries out there that tells you what kind of tooling you can use, and if you don't want to use tooling, what is it that you need to do in order to do this transition. Okay, so Jakarta EE Ambassadors, what are we? We're actually a grassroots group of people that contribute in many different ways to try to move the Jakarta EE technology forward. Obviously, as you can imagine from the branding there, we're actually officially approved by the Eclipse Foundation, but we're an independent, completely independent from the Eclipse Foundation, just a separate group of people, mostly just ordinary Java developers in there. So contributing in many different ways, right? So contributing by just doing something simple like what I'm doing today, delivering a talk or writing a blog entry, or something much more advanced, right? Including what I'll talk about a little bit later, and contributing to the actual specification projects to move the specifications forward. So believe it or not, while Jakarta E8 was going on, we actually sat down and talked about, okay, once we know it's going to take some time, we know microprofile is rolling forward. That's good news for Java developers. We also know that it's going to take some time for things to get moving again for Jakarta EE. In the meanwhile, why don't we take this opportunity to gather community feedback on what kind of work would we like to see once things begin rolling? Okay, so we actually put together, even before Jakarta E10 actually started, in the Jakarta E9 timeframe, we actually put together a contributors guide. So it's linked there. You can take a look at it. But it basically goes through and lists out, sort of wish list, right? Wish list items of things that we all thought in the community was important. And also some ideas of how you could go about engaging yourself in contributing to our app, right? So that is still a very good thing to take a look at. We will upgrade it, of course, once Jakarta E10 is done. We're going to revisit that entire process, get more community feedback, and come up with a Jakarta E11 contribution guide, right? So then you can read that one to understand how you can contribute to Jakarta E11. But I think even now we can take a look at the guide, and it'll give you a good idea of how you can contribute per spec. So if you want to follow us on Twitter, the Twitter handle is also there. Okay, let me stop for a minute. Are there any questions so far?
Not so far. So please go ahead.
Okay, let me keep going. So think of this one as a kind of a scoring card. Okay, so you can see the color coding there. So made it is the stuff in dark green, right? So these are things that we know have made it into the Jakarta E10 release. On the way is stuff that is still in planning or being committed, right? Being worked on actively, okay? Being thought about actively, but didn't make it in the Jakarta EE timeframe, or didn't get started in the Jakarta EE 10 timeframe. Okay, but it's definitely happening, which means these are prime candidates for happening in Jakarta EE 11 for sure. Okay, so these are the things that in the light green color, and then things that we know are important, and it's outlined in the Jakarta EE10 contribution guide, but hasn't really been committed to yet. But there's probably a good chance at least some of these things will get committed. Remember, when we wrote the Jakarta EE10 contribution guide, 0% of any of this was committed, right? And you can already see a lot of it happened, right? So I think same thing is going to happen with Jakarta EE11 also, right? So a lot of these things in black, I suspect they will move more into the light green or dark green soon enough, hopefully with some of your help. Okay, so this is the general theme of it. So in terms of CDI alignment, there's a bit of interesting work. The most interesting one is at asynchronous annotation. I'll talk about that in a moment. Better support for CDI in batch. Java, in terms of Java SE alignment, now you can use completions stage, fork join pool, parallel streams in Java EE in a safe way. There's a Bootstrap API for Jakarta REST that was added. There were some standardization gaps, some feature gaps that you only had to use maybe either microprofile or some proprietary API to do that is now standard. So things like OpenID Connect support, max executor definition, manage executor definition, UID as entity keys, so on. Right? And there's also a very important development called core profile or microservices profile. We called it microservices profile in the guide. Ultimately, it's now called core profile, but it's one and the same idea. And that's actually a very important development, right? It basically sort of is a forward-looking vision for Jakarta EE, at least for the microservices domain. Okay, and I'll explain what that is in just a moment. And a bunch of stuff that was deprecated or removed. And this is what you need to do in a platform that has so much age behind it, right? It's like in order to keep it refreshed, you need to begin removing things. So a lot of these features that you see here are basically things that were either deprecated or removed. Okay, so EJB entity beans, the EJB embedded EJB container, which hardly ever anybody used at all. Really old deprecated servlet faces and CDI features. Again, these have been on the deprecated list for, I think, minimum of 5 years now. So those are all finally removed and so on. So not a lot of new APIs being added this time, but a lot of new APIs are being worked on. I won't have the time to talk too much about it during this talk, but these are things like Jakarta NoSQL for NoSQL database access, Jakarta MVC as an alternative web framework, more JavaScript-friendly web framework, a dynamic configuration API, primarily suited to in the cloud, in my opinion. A repository API, so something like Delta Spike Data, and also gRPC. Hopefully, some of you have heard of gRPC already. It's basically an RPC protocol, like sort of a binary remote. You can think of it as binary remote method invocation protocol over the internet. Okay, the G, as you can imagine, is Google. All right, so gRPC support potentially. gRPC binding API, just like we have a REST binding API, a gRPC binding API may be happening for Jakarta EE 11 timeframe as well. All right, rolling forward. This is another view of Jakarta EE 10. This is basically looking at sort of all of the APIs that make up Jakarta EE 10, and you can see there's quite a bit of them. Some of them they're actually thinking about consolidating now. So I think this hopefully will get a tiny bit smaller and more readable. But as you can see, a lot of updates. A lot of these are minor updates. Okay, all the stuff in the dark blue color, and really nothing much new. The only new thing is CDI Lite, and it's really not so new. It's just really just a subset of CDI full, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And some APIs that didn't change at all. They just didn't need to change. They're relatively stable APIs. We actually, in all the stuff that is in this sort of lime green color, we actually don't even have anything for it in our wish list, right? So the only thing may be transactions, right? And that's about it. So this green stuff probably will remain unchanged for a little while. Okay, moving forward. So let's begin to do our feature tour, right? This is where I plan to spend most of our time on. So these are all of the different API changes that have made it into Jakarta EE 10 right now. So first is managed executor definition. I'll show you an example of this. It's much better to explain via example what this is. CDI based equivalent for EJB. Again, I'll show you an example of this. The easiest thing to take a look at is the example and then understand what it is. Managed completion stage, fork join, pool, and parallel streams. It's still too early. I don't have good code examples for this yet, but at some point in time, I will add at least one code example for this also. But basically, if you're familiar with completion stage, fork join, pool, and parallel streams, those are not actually designed with use in Java EE environments in mind. So in a Java EE environment, all of your threads are managed by the runtime. So the runtime can optimize the tools as the thread pool as it sees fit. So if you just use Java SE native threads, the container loses control over the thread pool. So basically what these things do is that they give you Java EE versions of those APIs that in fact work with the underlying app server's thread pool. Okay, so this work also has happened in Jakarta concurrency. So this is a very important bit of work. If you're using a managed runtime and you need these concurrency services. The other thing that I think again is a little bit difficult to explain if you don't take a look at the actual code sample is this cron-like triggers. So if you look at low-level API for Jakarta concurrency, there is a way of creating triggers. It used to be only very simple triggers, like that are based on sort of millisecond or something of that nature, time intervals only. And now you have a more cron-style trigger, so you can give it a cron expression to say, hey, trigger this bit of code, and the trigger is this cron expression. Okay, so much more powerful. I'm hoping actually that this functionality will, in the next iteration, will be used to implement the @schedule annotation, okay, that we do have in our wish list. Okay, so quick example. Here's an example of the managed executor definition. So this is about managed executor service. Okay, so managed executor service. There's an executor service in Java SE. You can use it to basically spawn threads in a more usable managed way. Managed executor service is the same thing, but in a Java EE environment. So it used to be that you have to define managed executor services in a vendor-specific way, in an app server-specific way, probably using something like a server.xml specific to the app server. So now you don't need to do that anymore. You can define it using just annotations. So this managed executor definition annotation, this is how you define it. So you use define things like, hey, what is the size of this thread pool that I want? What's its name? How do I want propagation to be handled? So the transaction propagation, security propagation, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so a really nice usability and portability environment in improvement. Asynchronous annotation. This used to be an EJB, and the EJB one was a little bit out of date. So one of the things was you couldn't specify in that asynchronous annotation what thread pool you want to actually use. It was always using the default thread pool, the app server's default thread pool. The other thing was the EJB asynchronous annotation was also tied to EJB. So you had to use an EJB, right? The only place you could use asynchronous is an EJB. It also only used Java util future, which is a very old blocking API. So basically, the asynchronous annotation solves all of those problems. It's part of Jakarta concurrency. It's not part of EJB. It's CDI based, so you can apply this annotation on any CDI bean. And as you can see in the example, you can actually give it what executor that you want to use. So you have much more fine-grained control about who's actually spinning these new threads on your behalf. And then it's also capable of using completable features, which is a much better asynchronous API than Java util future is. So you can take a quick example here. Right? So if you're familiar with completable feature, then this will look pretty straightforward. Right? So basically, most of this is you can't get any more easier than this, frankly speaking. If you're going to just write a simple asynchronous code, this is as simple as you're going to get, basically. So a really nice annotation to have around. Okay, so some major changes went into the Jakarta REST API. So if you're using REST-EZ or CFX or what have you, you're probably using some kind of Jakarta REST, formerly known as JAX-RS. A bunch of changes went in here. A standalone Bootstrap API, I'll show you an example of that. It's easier to explain that way. I'll also give you an example of multi-part form data. As you may be aware, like in order to do any kind of quote-unquote injection in Jakarta REST, you need to use this one-off annotation called @context instead of using @inject. So we were actually hoping this was going to happen in Jakarta E10, but it's almost there. It's going to happen in Jakarta E11 definitely. So no more @context annotation. We'll just use @inject, just like we use for pretty much everything else. But this was deprecated as a result. Okay, so in this release, they went ahead and said, okay, we're going to replace this with @inject. We're going to replace this with CDI. You better be prepared for that. And we're declaring the @context to be deprecated. And there's more sort of lower level changes. I won't talk too much about it. You can take a look at maybe a good blog entry on Jakarta REST, and maybe you could write it. There's some smaller grain changes, like better support for HTTP cookies, although I really don't know why you would want to set up HTTP cookies in a REST service, maybe if you're using it as a front-end controller. So there's better support for that. There's slightly better support for exception mapping. The exception mapping basically wasn't anything there at all in Jakarta REST. So now they've added some sort of sensible default rules to be able to do automatic exception mapping for you, so that you don't get like basically, oh, I don't know what happened, HTTP 500 error or something like that. You get a better error to say, okay, this is what the error description was. All right, standalone Bootstrap API. Why is this needed? Primarily, it is a good API to have if you are using, if you're invoking a REST service outside of a Java EE environment. Okay, so let's say in a unit test or an integration test, or in another container that it doesn't make sense to use Java EE that much, and all you really need to do is just invoke a RESTful web service. So you can use this Java SE Bootstrap API to do that. Right? So it's a very simple API. It's called SE Bootstrap. You say bootstrap.start. You give it the application. So what service you would want instantiated. So you would instantiate that service, and lo and behold, it'll get a very simple HTTP server that just is capable of Jakarta REST up and running. Okay, and then you can go ahead and invoke that API as you so wish, right? So again, ideal use case, you can definitely see a good use case of this would be integration testing. So if you have, in my example, if you have greeting resource, and it's actually something that you deploy with the Java EE application, and you just want to write a simple integration test for it, this is how you do it. Again, if you're in some kind of environment where all you really need is just a small RESTful service, and you don't need a full container, you can think of a utility API or something of that nature. You can use this Java SE Bootstrap API to do that. Okay. Multi-part form data. Again, the primary use case for this one, again, is when you are using Jakarta REST as basically a backend technology for a JavaScript frontend. Okay, so some of you may be familiar with what multi-part form data is, but if you're not, I'll tell you. So basically, typically when you make a HTTP request or response, you get one body. Okay, so in that one body, there is usually one type only, one MIME type only. But you can actually do something more than that if you want to do something like multi-part. All right, so you want to send effectively multiple bodies with multiple types attached to it. So every single Jakarta REST vendor had a different way of doing this. Everybody kind of sort of supported this, but they did it in their own way. So now you actually have a standard way of doing this. So this is how the API looks like. I won't go too much about it. You can imagine, okay, a resume submission website. So with your resume, you want your name, you want a photo of yourself, probably you want the actual resume and so on. So you can do this as a single form submission, and with each of the in the form, you will basically have different MIME times for all of these things. So name could be text string, for example. Recent photo could be JPEG, resume could be PDF, or what have you. Okay, so on the server side, this is how you would process it. You would process it using param form with the name. Okay, and then you can either do automatic type translation like the string, or you can get the underlying raw data of the MIME type itself. So you will use entity part to do that. So once you get the entity part, you can get the media type, you can get the actual content, and some other metadata. All right, so this is a simple example of how to do it. There's also, you can also, if you want, get an array of entity parts and parse them out yourself. You don't have to use this form param annotation if you don't want it. Okay, moving forward. All right, so Jakarta Security is another important one. There's actually a number of changes that we wanted to see here. Not a lot of the changes made in, but one important change did make in, and that's OpenID Connect support. I'll show you that in a moment. It's easier to explain that way. There was also a few changes that happened in the lower level APIs that Jakarta Security uses, and also some very minor changes in the Jakarta EE Security API also, like making the service principal serializable, adding some default methods and generics in Jakarta authentication, adding generic type support in Jakarta authorization, and so on. Unless you're a vendor, you probably won't notice much of these things. Maybe only the serializable principle. But regardless, basically the main headline feature for Jakarta Security this time, I think still an important one, is OpenID Connect, is OpenID authentication. So these days, people don't really use the old school sort of form name and password on every single website anymore. Right? What they tend to use is some kind of unified login. So it's either unified login with something like Google or Microsoft, or their own OpenID Connect server. Typically, Azure Active Directory is very important. It is very popular for this. So what you do here is that you say, okay, when I want to log in, I'll just go to this other website on Google or on Microsoft to do my authentication there. But once that's done, I want to get back to my application. And then when I get back, I want that authorization information and authentication information to be there. Okay, so this is what OpenID Connect does. So in Jakarta Security, everything honestly is very, very simple, right? So there's a similar annotation to this for databases also, and LDAP, okay, if you're using those, but it's a very similar format, right? So you have the OpenID authentication definition, and that's more or less all you need to do in order to secure an application. You give it things like the provider URI, the client ID, basically the secret you share with the provider. The client secret is another part of the key. The redirection callback. So where is it actually going to be called back to when it does come back, redirect to original resource, so on. Okay, so pretty straightforward for stuff if you're familiar with OpenID Connect, and probably one of the easiest OpenID Connect APIs that you can imagine. All right. Jakarta Persistence, or JPA, a lot of you are probably using this, particularly in Hibernate, probably. So a number of important changes happened in Jakarta Security. We now have support for UUID as keys. I think this is a particularly good one in cloud environments. A lot of people don't have the database generate the IDs anymore. You can do that in the Java side of things, but using UUIDs instead. You can just store the information in the Java side. So that it has good support for that now. Also, some smaller grain changes, I think, but important changes nonetheless. There's some gaps in, there's certain things, certain common SQL language features that you really couldn't use in JPQL before this. Now you can. So these are things like, all these math functions like ceiling, exponent, floor, log, power, so on, and the extract function. So extract is basically useful if you want a subset of some kind of data. You typically date time data. So extract is another SQL feature. Now it's part of JPQL also. And in order to better align with the Java datetime API changes back in Jakarta EE 8, there's now some corresponding JPQL methods to get the correct data type and basically data from the database that correspond to those types, right? So you can get a local date, a local date time, a local time, and so on, right? And it'll give it to you in the right data type for the Java datetime API. Some other stuff like the entity manager factory and entity manager now use the auto closable interface. If you happen to be managing those things and opening and closing them yourself, it's a little bit easier to use with the try resources block, because it's now auto closable. Okay, here's a simple example of the EID keys. I think this will be much better documented in a little bit once things like Hibernate and Eclipse Link actually implement this. You'll see how this is implemented and you can test it out. But the API is very simple. Basically, you can have UID, Java utility UID as a type, and you can specify that as your ID and a generated value. Okay, all right. Moving forward, Jakarta Faces, an oldie but goodie. A lot of people still using Jakarta Faces. For me, it's still my favorite. I have to tell you, it's the easiest way to write a web UI as a Java developer, in my opinion, and also the best supported. There's some really good runtimes like Muhara and MyFaces to do that. So a number of changes for Jakarta Faces users, folks that are like me that are still fans. Okay, so client window scoped is an important one. This actually is a more usable version of flow scoped, basically, right? So it basically gives you a scope to a client window, right? So if you want to open up a new window, or you open up a new basically flow altogether, you get a new state. But as long as you're within that same window and within that same basically JSF request lifecycle, you have that scope alive for that period of time. One of the things that's pretty interesting, I'll show you an example of this. You used to write views pretty much in facelets, more or less, for JSF. But if you're a really diehard Java fan and you want to write your views in Java, well, you can do that now using the add view annotation. Again, I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. There's something called extensionless mapping, so you don't need an extension to access a JSF page anymore. The JSF pages look more like RESTful UI URLs, without an extension. And there's a simple, basically context parameter that you do in order to set that, and then suddenly you don't need the .jsf extension at all, or .faces extension at all. You can just use no extension, and it will still map to your correct JSF file. There's a new type attribute introduced in input text. So if you're familiar with HTML5, it introduces all these different types of in text field, right? So now you can use those basically in line with input text by simply saying what type of input text do you want. So in my example, an email or a color picker or whatever it is that you want, you can just specify one of the HTML5 types. Multiple and accept in input file. Input file is a pretty well used one. Whenever you need to do any kind of uploads in JSF, typically you would use input file. Now it has a multiple and accept attributes. Multiple basically allows you to select multiple files. You didn't used to be able to do that. If you wanted to do that, you'd probably use something like prime faces, but now you can do that in normal JSF. So you can do multiple select files, and then you can also just specify what type of file do you want. Okay, so in your file dialog, what it'll show a filtering of what the types are supposed to be. There's some other small things like layout equals list. So these checkbox and radio button rendering usually was tables. So now it's using more modern list layout, so you can more easily apply things like CSS. There's an on error attribute added to the f-WebSocket tag, and f-WebSocket is really nice. It allows you to do very simple WebSocket programming. Instead of needing to write all this JavaScript WebSocket code, you can very easily make use of sort of the f-WebSocket tag in a typical JSF fashion. It's very abstracted, but now there's a new attribute called on error in addition to on close. And then there was a few other things added, like a couple of new component types. Probably most important one to note is that certain things have been altogether removed now. Right? These were deprecated, now they're removed. So if you're still using them, you better figure it out now. Okay, so no more JSP support in Jakarta Faces. It still remains in the Jakarta platform as JSP. If you're using just JSP, you're fine, but you won't be able to use them inside of JSF anymore. And managed beans, if you're still using like old-fashioned JSF managed beans, you won't be able to use those anymore either. Okay, so basically that support is going to be gone. You better think about moving to either CDI, or if you're a Spring user and you're using JSF, well, your only real option becomes Spring. You can't use the managed beans anymore. Okay, so here's a pure Java Faces view. I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm gonna move it along a little bit. Basically, this allows you to write your UIs completely in Java, right? So you don't have to write any kind of tagging language whatsoever. Certainly not facelets if you don't want it. It's a kind of a nice thing to have if you're a total Java purist. Me personally, I wouldn't go that far. I think markup is markup. Trying to write markup in Java, I don't know if there's that much benefit to it. But yeah, if this is your thing, and you like things like Vaadin, for example, that's Vaadin has the same deal. You write your UI in Java, so now you can do this with JSF also. Okay, so core profile is a pretty important thing. So I talked about microprofile already. Microprofile really just uses a small subset of Jakarta EE specs, really just 4. Okay, so it's the REST, the JSON APIs, and CDI, pretty much. Okay, so the idea here is to say, instead of microprofile just sort of borrowing these specs, right? Why not create a profile that says, okay, you can, if you want to use only these three or 4 specs, you can certify against just those specs. You don't have to borrow them, right? So hopefully down the line, what's going to happen is microprofile will say that, okay, we're not just borrowing these specs. We simply declare dependency on Jakarta EE core profile. So what that means is, when you get certified with microprofile, you're also certifying with Jakarta core profile. Now, there's another use case where people just want to use the core profile. They just want to certify against the core profile. So I think things like Quarkus and Helidon and Open Liberty, these will sooner or later become core profile certified implementations. But those actually also implement microprofile also. So there'll be microprofile compatible implementations, which will mean that ultimately they're also implementing the core profile. And that's sort of the next generation of Jakarta EE, if you will. But then there's also things like Micronaut. The Micronaut folks haven't said anything yet, but they've been heavily involved certainly in the creation of CDI Lite, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And when I look at the Micronaut API, it would be very easy for them, actually, to adopt the core profile. So I hope it happens, right? And that's why I have this big old ugly possible sticker here. So I hope the possible actually becomes probable and reality at some point. We'll see. Okay, so as you can see, in the core profile, you don't have CDI, you have CDI Lite. All right, so CDI Lite, as you can imagine, is basically a subset of CDI. Okay, it's not actually much of a subset, to be honest. So the way CDI is structured, there's CDI full, which is all the core APIs, CDI EE that basically has CDI and EE integration pieces, so things like EJB bindings and the like. And then CDI Java SE, and that's just to basically more or less the Bootstrap API to get CDI full running in a Java SE environment, more or less. So what is different between CDI, core CDI, and CDI full and CDI full and CDI Lite? Basically, just a few things, right? So a few things are not there. These are things like session and conversation scope, which session scope and conversation scope, you wouldn't really be using those unless you're using JSF. Bean validation mode all It's kind of an anti-pattern, right? So basically you're saying, hey, scan all of my classes to figure out which ones should be injected. Things like portable extensions, that's a big one. Okay, so portable extensions allows you to write CDI extensions that work on any CDI runtime. The problem is the portable extensions API was very heavily bound to reflection. Okay, so one of the objectives of this CDI Lite is to get it working with Graal VM, which doesn't have reflection. So you need to come up with an alternative to portable extensions that also works across CDI runtimes, but also works with CDI all, CDI Lite, and full runtimes. So now there's this new thing called build compatible extensions. When I look at it, it basically just looks like a modernized version of portable extensions. Literally, it's almost exactly the same set of functions, except one happens at runtime, so you have more dynamism, and one happens at build time, so you have a little bit less dynamism. That's pretty much about it. Okay, so in CDI core you have build compatible extensions. In CDI full you have portable extensions and build compatible implementation extensions. But I suspect there'll be less and less people that will be motivated to write portable extensions. They're probably just going to write build compatible extensions. Is in my prediction. We'll see how that goes. Things like decorators that really weren't used very much. Passivation, again, would only really be useful with JSF. So if you're not using JSF and you're using a headless service, let's say, then you don't actually need this feature. So yeah, this is why with CDI Lite you don't have those particular things. But you do have another breaking change, and this one is a big one. Okay. So now if you have an empty beans.xml, that used to mean that your bean discovery mode is by default all. Going forward, that's going to be annotated. Okay, so if you're depending on bean discovery mode all, you better explicitly specify it in your empty beans XML now. Okay, going forward. All right, some other changes in Java EE 10, Java SE 11 is required, Java SE 17 is supported. All right, there's some changes in batch, like I said, to better align with CDI. So now batch artifacts are required. If CDI is present, they're required to support CDI. You can inject things like the job operator. You used to be only be able to look it up, which was kind of an odd API. So now you can inject it. A little bit better type injection support for batch property. Again, this was kind of weird. You had to write this conversion code because you can only inject strings. Now you can inject more sensible Java types. There's some small changes in the JSON binding if you happen to be a heavy user of that, and some small JPMS support. Basically, making it required for all of the APIs to support JPMS. I don't know what the practical usage of that would be right now, since JPMS hasn't really picked up that much. But either way, it did happen. All right. So not a whole lot of time. I'm going to skip this over. Take a look at this later. This slide deck, by the way, is already on my speaker deck account. You can look at speaker deck and search for me, and you'll find this. So these are the possible themes for Java SE 11. Basically, take out all the green stuff from my slide before, and more or less this is what you wind up with, right? So still some pretty cool stuff to look forward to in Java SE in Jakarta EE 11. Hopefully it will. The work is already starting. I'm hoping next year maybe, or somewhere thereof, I'll be able to tell you all about Jakarta EE 11. All right, so ways of contributing. Again, all of this is outlined in the contributors guide. It's the same information that's probably not going to change much between the Jakarta EE 10 and Jakarta EE 11 contribution guide. Feel free to again stay engaged in the Jakarta EE Ambassadors Twitter handle. You can get engaged with the process, and basically as we rev up the 10 contribution guide to the 11 contribution guide, you'll be able to see all of these things in much more detail. But basically, to summarize, a few things you can do. If all you want to do is learn more, you can sign up to the mailing lists. If you want to do a specific change, you need to get it on the projects. If you want to actually submit a change, it's also very, very simple. It's all on GitHub. All you really need to do is sign this thing called the ECA, and then you can begin issuing pull requests. If you want to do a bit more than that, and you become a committer on a project, you need a little bit more paperwork. I won't go over that, okay? But that's usually much later, to be honest. And if you need any help with any of this, right, or if you want any kind of engagement with Jakarta EE, obviously you can feel free to engage a Jakarta EE ambassador, myself included. We'll try to help you the best we can. Okay, so wrapping up my summary, 8, 9, 9.1, all good stuff. Begin evaluating it, begin taking a look at it. EE10, a lot of important stuff that's been hanging around for a long time. I think even if you're not an EE user, you'll find things that were useful, that are pertinent to you. And Jakarta 11 work is already ongoing. Okay, it has already started. We will rev up the Jakarta 11 contribution guide also, but you need to get involved, right? And time to get in any time is a good time to get involved. There's many different ways of doing that. For now, you could just use the Jakarta E10 contribution guide and figure out, okay, this is stuff already happened. This is stuff that's happening. Why don't I see if I can make the next stuff that should happen. All right. Resources. Jakarta1.org has a lot of recordings. There's also a Jakarta EE YouTube channel. You can log on to there. You'll see many different recordings there. If you want to join just one Jakarta EE alias, make it the Jakarta EE community alias. A lot of interesting stuff happens there that are a little bit on the non-technical side. And of course, always do follow the official Twitter handle at Jakarta EE. There's another nice thing that's their monthly tech talks. Okay, so you can definitely join the Jakarta Tech Talks if you want. Alrighty, and that's about it for me. Let me see if there's any last-minute questions. Otherwise, I'm going to actually, since I'm also out of time, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And
There are actually a couple of questions that we can take. So the first one is from Kanahbal, and I'm sorry if I misread the name, is what level of Java experience must I be in to start contributing to Jakarta EE?
I would say there's a lot of different work that very junior people can contribute to. You'll have to basically work with probably in your case, you would want to work with a Jakarta EE ambassador that can help you get you into the process. I've seen people contribute to things like the samples and the docs, and even cargo tracker or the starter projects. These are all documented in the contribution guide. I think you can do this with as little as maybe 5 years of Java experience, in my opinion.
Cool. Another question from Kanabal as well. Do you have an Arabic community for contributing to navigate and break down what's to do? I don't think such thing
Not yet.
exists yet.
If you wanna get it started, you can reach out to me. I'll connect you to the Eclipse Foundation people, and we can figure out what to do. If language is a barrier, though, it's going to be a big barrier, to be honest. Because ultimately, who you will be working with is people across the world. I guess what they speak English, right? So
yeah. Another question from Mahmoud, one of the Arab Jug leaders. How is the improvement of standard APIs handled across multiple implementations? For example, how do fixes in Jersey make their way to JAX RS and then synchronize to other providers like REST Easy?
Typically, it's a continuous process. So most of these standards-based implementations, like things like Jersey or REST Easy, they don't like to have many proprietary features, to be honest, right? Because what they find is that people don't really want to use proprietary features for that long. So typically, if there's anything useful, and that is not like super specific, to that implementation and just not portable at all, you can expect most of that stuff to wind up in the spec sooner or later, right? Probably within, my guess would be 1 or 2 years. And vice versa, the implementations are pretty good about catching up with the latest version of the spec, and people in that community seems to be pretty collaborative, right? So taking each other's ideas, that doesn't seem to be a big issue. It's pretty rapid cycles. Yeah, in fact, you can expect probably 80 to 90% of whatever is vendor specific at any given point to probably wind up in the standard sooner or later.
Awesome. Thank you. Another question from Abdullah. What about JSTL? Will they
Will
be
it be
removed as well?
removed? I don't think so. So JSTL, as you know, is very heavily tied to JSP.
Yeah.
JSP isn't being evolved that much. Like there hasn't, I don't think there has been any release since maybe Java E7, if I'm correct. It's an old, mature technology. If you use it, you use it. Same thing for JSTL. I don't think there's any reason to remove it because it's like these are just still so very heavily relied upon and so many people using it. I don't see it evolving much though, right? But if there's something you want to change in JSP and JSTL, that's another reason to get involved and implement that whatever change that you would like to see.
Great. I think that's pretty much it. Any final words, Reza?
No, I hope you guys enjoyed. If you have any questions and anything I can help you with, reach out to me on Twitter. Obviously I'll try my best to help you. Other than that, not a whole lot. I hope this was a useful talk, and hopefully, if the time and opportunity allows, I can come back and deliver another talk. Maybe improve my Arabic skills a bit by then. But it's okay.
For sure. Thanks a lot, Reza. Thanks for your time, and thanks for this great talk and taking time to answer the questions for our community. Thanks a lot, and hope to see you around soon with another talk and knowledge sharing. Thanks a lot.
For
And
sure. Shukran.
شكرا لك، وشكرا لمتتبعينا الكرام الذين تابعونا خلال الساعة الماضية. نضرب لكم موعدا في الشهر القادم إن شاء الله الرحمن الرحيم بموضوع جديد وحلقة جديدة. في انتظار ذلك، شكرا لكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.